Great introduction to that psalm as we recount the way that God is blessed and all the reasons for which God is blessed. And we get that wonderful list of them. And then the psalmist turns just a little bit at verse 7 to remind us about Moses and the children of Israel. But the psalmist is writing far, far after that occurrence. But I think wanting to remind us that the Lord is blessed not just for what God does today, but this is the God of our history. This is the God of our past. This is the God of our present, and sets it up for people to understand this will also be the God of our future. And part of that, the past, the present, and the future, for us to really understand the attribute of God that allows all of these other attributes to be made known, is that we have a God of forgiveness, abundant mercy that comes upon us. And so the psalmist recounts this and even gives wonderful imagery for us to try to attempt to understand the boundlessness of God's forgiveness. The psalmist talks about the forgiveness is as far as the east is from the west. Now for us, we might say, that's not that bad. I can get on a really quick plane and probably circle the globe in about 24 hours. So the east being separated from the west doesn't make nearly as much sense to us as it might be to somebody hearing this at the time the psalmist is writing it. For them, the vast majority of people would never make it all the way to the east coast, to the west coast of where they were living. That would seem like an eternal quest to get there. Such was God's boundless forgiveness. Talks about the stars in the heaven. People would have known that reaching the heavens, the sun, the moon, the stars would clearly be unattainable to them. They might not have really talked about it in light years as just how far away those objects were, but they didn't need to. They still knew how vast God's forgiveness was described in all of that. That might be the backdrop by which Jesus comes to teach this parable to his disciples. It might be the backdrop by which Peter even asked his question. Actually, Pastor Nate and I got to talk about this a few weeks ago at Take a Chance Sunday. We just had those first opening verses of Peter's question and Jesus' response to Peter about forgiving 77 times. Peter thought he was bringing an abundance of forgiveness into the equation, and God expands it beyond human comprehension, and then goes on to tell us this parable. Now, for the sake of the parable, we should figure out a couple of these units of measure that were used in Jesus' day. Many of you heard this before, but sometimes I know they sort of get out of your mind and out of your memory. We're first going to go to the 100 denarii. This was the second slave who owed 100 denarii. A denarii is what a common laborer would earn in a day. You go out, work in the field for the day, you clean somebody's house, you repair their car, you work all day, you'll get a denarii. You could take that and have enough to live on that day and just enough savings over to get you through the Sabbath. So if you work 6 days, you'd have your day of Sabbath and you could get by. That was a sustainable income, but not a lot to save after all of that. So somebody who's actually saving 100 denarii would have to be extremely frugal along the way to amass even paying back 100 days' wages as a part of that. That was a large debt. But that person had also been forgiven of a debt that was 10,000 talents. Now, I had always heard that a talent was what you would earn in an entire year, but there are some commentaries suggest that was even more, even up to 15 years of wages for a single talent. And now Jesus is telling us this parable about 10,000 talents. You might as well have told the people that the debtor was indebted a star that they would somehow have to reach up and get and bring back to the one that they owed. This was an insurmountable debt that they were forgiven. And that's the backdrop that Jesus uses when he comes to us to talk about the immense way that we're going to conjure up what it means for this God of forgiveness. So Jesus gives us this two examples of one who was forgiven the whole debt, but then one who was refusing to forgive a much, much smaller debt. And then we hear that the fellow slaves saw what had happened. They saw their fellow slave not offering forgiveness. And I think the most important phrase in there it said is they, the fellow slaves, were greatly distressed. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we face at times is we think, well, if I don't forgive, that's just really on me. I mean, I know there are people that maybe I should have offered more forgiveness who I just couldn't bring myself to it. And we think, but that's on me. I'll deal with the consequences of that. Whether they're emotional, physical, psychological, spiritual, those are things that I own. But we would hear in this parable that they are not. That when we do not offer forgiveness, it does not just bring stress on us, it brings stress into the entire community. My single action of not offering forgiveness can put stress on an entire community. And I could think maybe even there, I can somehow get myself through that, except for the fact that Jesus, talking about that stress when he started out giving us this parable, when he started telling us what this parable was all about, he was not talking about me. He was not talking about the stress that I might feel. Jesus was comparing this abundance of forgiveness to the very kingdom of heaven. Now, I might want to pass on that and say, you know what? I'll deal with that when I get to the kingdom of heaven. Right here on earth, I'm going to own my stuff. And if I want to own my not forgiving, or if I want to own my forgiving, that's on me until Jesus teaches us to pray. And then we have to get through that phrase somehow. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as in heaven. And what I am asking in that I enter into this parable as someone who now brings forgiveness, that I enter into this parable understanding the consequences of forgiveness, not just for me, but for the very idea, the very possibility that the kingdom of heaven could somehow come to earth. And yet if I refuse forgiveness, I am in a complete roadblock to that ever happening. And not just for me, but I'm a roadblock for all of you. If I can't find forgiveness, it puts stress on the entire community, and we'll never understand the kingdom of heaven in our midst. That's what I think Jesus wanted us to understand. And Jesus gets at it at the very end. When he talks about the fact there's this kind of whole torture thing at the end, I don't have time to get into all of that. What we need to understand is this. In the end, Jesus is not so concerned about the financial aspects of our debt. Jesus is not so much concerned about the banking responsibilities that we have, because Jesus said this: the kingdom of heaven will never be right unless we have forgiveness in our heart. That's where Jesus really wants forgiveness to live. Jesus really wants us to know we are people who have hearts of forgiveness for ourselves, for our community, that the very kingdom of heaven might be made known. It cannot happen if I become a barrier to it. It only happens if I believe that God's forgiveness is so abundant, so overwhelming for me, that I cannot live unless I offer that forgiveness to another. Only then can I be an example of and a pathway for the kingdom of heaven to be known on earth. Amen.